I'm Tom Hamilton. I'm a composer and performer of electronic music. And I'm doing a concert on the Interpretation series April 24th. I also have 5 wonderful soloists with me. Nate Wooley, the trumpeter, Peter Zummo, the trombonist, Al Margolis, playing objects and violin, Alan Zimmerman, who's a percussionist, and Meaghan Burke, who's playing cello and using her voice in some interesting ways. I started out working with electronics in the mid-60s, and as a kid I was very involved with amateur radio and had a little workshop in the basement and built little circuits, some of which didn't work very well. And when I was introduced to electronic music in my first year of college, I think, an older friend who knew about my interest in radio said, "Why don't you try building some circuits?" And so I did, and I built some little circuits in little aluminum boxes, and they, much to my surprise, these things did work, and I started stringing them together and making pieces. I was working on other music at the same time as a student, and I was very interested in jazz, and I'm a self-taught jazz piano player. Played a lot of gigs in those days. And as time progressed, I just got more and more interested in electronic music, and it became the predominant medium for me. But because of my background in improvisation and jazz, I wanted to find a way to make the electronics work in combination with people who played acoustic instruments and use some of the same principles in playing as those people did. This evolved into a set of principles for live playing, and from that I started doing sound installation pieces, just electronic. But what I'd always hoped in those pieces is that somehow a musician would walk into the room and start playing. And within, I would say in the mid-'80s, I started finding some opportunities for that to happen. In sort of finding my place in the music in the 90s, I developed this idea that I wanted to make electronic sound environments that functioned as aural scores for improvising soloists. In other words, that the players would hear what was going on in the room with the electronics as context, and they would respond in a way that they felt was appropriate, regardless of the way somebody else would be responding at the same time. The pieces that I had done in the 90s and in the last decade somehow always had an external idea that organized them in some way. I would find something of interest somewhere else in my life. There was the subway. I did a piece that had to do with fluctuations in the price of gold called London Fix. But the idea that there was another thought that organized it seemed to be a starting point for me. In this piece, I thought a lot about that, and I just, I couldn't come up with that idea. Finally, I had a structure, and I had a lot of complexity, and I looked at the whole thing, and I went, I don't want to do this. I want to just start with the sounds. So in my way of doing these things and organizing them, I just make sounds. I'll make a sequence of material that might last a minute, might last 6 minutes, and I'll layer it with other material, and I have a way of bringing things in and out that has sort of a random element to it as well. And all this is just kind of creating a weaving or a soundtrack that has a certain amount of unpredictability to it, both for me and for the other performers. The form of the piece is kaleidoscopic and recursive, in that all the elements are defined and known, that is, in the electronics, and that these elements can combine with each other in different ways. Sometimes we hear them once, sometimes they come back, but again, they are functioning to provide changing context for the improvising soloist. Two of the soloists in the piece are people that I've worked with for many years. The longest association that I've had is with Peter Zummo, the trombonist. And we have worked together as a duo since the early 90s. And Peter and I have played on each other's larger pieces at different times. We've kind of evolved a style that is based on simultaneity rather than intention. Now, when I've worked with Al Margolis, it's also been in combinations, in duos, and with other performers, oftentimes outside of New York, in settings with people we've met in New England. And this spring, before this concert, we're going on a little tour of the Midwest, and so we'll be working with some other people as well. And Al has a wonderful sense of playing the violin that has nothing to do with the tradition of the violin. I don't think that's telling tales out of school, but that's the way it is. He also has an unusual amount of objects that he can bring to a performance to create very unpredictable sound combinations. And he, in other parts of his life, he also works with electronics. I actually met Meaghan Burke through the first concert of the interpretation series this fall, which was organized by Muhal Richard Abrams. And we got along so well musically, and there was just a lot of good feelings about it, and I just am so excited to have Meaghan on this concert. I met percussionist Alan Zimmerman when I produced a concert of the music of composer Eric Richards. And I loved Alan's sensibility and attention to detail and the range of sounds that he got from his instruments. I also knew that he worked on just a small amount of music per year and paid attention to every detail in that music. And I've been fortunate to be able to record him on some projects where he's done the music of other composers. So this is the first time out that Alan is working on my music. I also grew up in a tradition of trumpet playing, I guess a tradition of very bad trumpet playing. But I always pay attention to trumpet players, and what I've noticed is that Nate Wooley is probably the most unusual of the people that I'm currently hearing. It's always a pleasure to hear him out in public, and I'm very much looking forward to this first time out with my music. Even when I've made pieces that develop themes from experiences in the rest of the world or in the rest of my life, my pieces aren't really about anything. I feel more that I'm making sound events to be experienced just really in the sonic world. I'm not trying to interpret things. I'm not trying to communicate anything. I'm certainly not trying to work with ideas that are about anything other than the experience of the sound itself. So to that standpoint, the one thing that I would like people to do when they regard one of my pieces is to listen in the present time, not to worry about what might have happened in the previous part of the piece or what might be coming up, but just sort of stay in the moment with the piece, because for me, that's the experience.